Hello, my name is Alan. I'm a computing teacher, but I now work for a business based in Bradford called EXA. We call the activities that I run EXA Foundation. Now, you might not know this, but the word EXA, that means 10 to the power of 18. So that's like a 1 followed by 18 zeros. Or put it another way, you might have heard of a gigabyte. Well, a gigabyte is 1,000 million bytes. So what's an exabyte? Well, an exabyte, there has 1,000 million gigabytes in just one exabyte. Now you're probably wishing you hadn't asked. Oh, you didn't? Okay. Today we're going to go on, we're going to travel. We're going to go on 3 mini adventures to different locations to help us learn a little bit more about computing and the history of computer science. Now, it might not be possible to travel to any of these locations at the moment, but perhaps in the next few months. And if you are, just make sure you check ahead that these attractions and locations are open and available. So I need to share something with you, first of all. So let me just get something ready. Now, what I want to do for the first adventure and the others, I want to ask you some questions. And I don't expect that you'll already know the answers to these questions, but it's to help your brain get in gear and for you to figure out what you think you already know. So for the first adventure, I'd say we take computers for granted nowadays. They've become part of our everyday life and we use them often without even realizing that we are. But have you ever wondered, when did the very first computers begin? Did an inventor just wake up one day and go, oh, let's invent a computer today? Well, no, that's not how it happened really. But we are going to go and find out. So I do have some questions that I'd like you to ponder over. And you can see there's 5 on the screen. And I'd like you to think, first of all, whether you know the answers or not. And even if you don't, then just guess something. You never know how far or close you might be. And I'm going to give you some clues. So in the East Midlands, just south of Birmingham, there's an attraction you can go to. And while you're there, you can see what people agree is the world's first computer. So my first question I'm asking you, well, where is this? Where in the East Midlands? Now, most places in England, you could travel there and back in a day, with it being in the Midlands. Here's the clue, the name of the computer. So that's question number 2. Well, it comes from the name of something else. So there used to be a enormous statue somewhere. I don't think it's still standing. And they called this statue a particular name, begins with the letter C. And the word means absolutely huge, or we use that word now to describe something as huge. And that's the same name as this computer, or this computer is called after it. Question number 3. So rather than tell me the exact year that this computer was built, I'm asking you to guess the decade. Now, in terms of giving you clues, the best I could say is sometime between the 1870s and the 1980s. So that's 110 years. Pick a decade somewhere between 1870 and 1980. Now, when this computer was first built, it was built with a very special purpose in mind, a special top secret purpose. And for a long time, for a good 30 years after it was built, many people didn't know because of its top secret nature. So there's a strong clue. And then the 5th question, question number 5, it's still in use, it's still in operation today. So we will visit it in a moment, but my question is, what's it being used for today? So now might be a good time to pause. You can look at your answers, decide what it is, and you could even pause just for a few moments to think about whether you need more time or not. And then we're about to go and visit this location. So I'm on a website now. You will recognize this. This is the National Museum of Computing, and they have an online virtual tour that you can explore. So I'm just loading the tour up now. Now, I'm lucky. I've been to the National Museum of Computing lots of times. So when I explore their virtual tour, I kind of know where I'm going. So there's lots of different directions. This is a little bit like a video game that I could choose to go in. And I'm going to just make a short detour through this room here. So this room is known as the Bomb Gallery. And all of the objects and artifacts in this particular gallery are all to do with encryption of top security or top secret codes during mostly the Second World War and some of the First World War. So you'll see things like an Enigma machine. If you'll have seen, I'm sure, documentaries or films about this machine here known as the bomb. And what this did is just amazing. It simulated numbers of Enigma machines. But remember, why are we here? We're here to discover the world's first computer. So while the bomb is absolutely amazing in terms of what is achieved, it's not defined as being a computer. So we're going to go into another gallery not far away, just down the corridor, and we'll see calculating machines and this glass cases here. And I'm heading down this corridor here with the blue carpet. And when I asked a question before, what's the name of this computer? Well, we'll see the name. Oh, it was on that window just then. I don't know if you saw, there was the first clue. And we're coming up to a sign here, an illuminated sign, and it says, welcome to the Colossus Gallery. So the computer is called Colossus, which is the same name as this statue that I mentioned. And we look in the room, we're expecting to see something huge. Let's move in a bit closer. Well, actually, it is enormous. I'd say it's bigger than most people's family car. If I was stood next to it right now, it is taller than I am. I can have a walk around the back of it. And as I do so, you can peer through the middle of it. And there are racks and racks of what are known as thermionic valves, possibly close to 2,000 of them altogether. And this particular computer, Colossus, so this is known as Colossus Mark II. There were 10 of these built altogether. They'd started building an 11th one. And as I move around here, this might be easier to explain. Oh, look, there's a fan on the floor. You can probably figure out why that's there. So these valves, thermionic, therm to do with heat, they were like electrical light bulbs in as much as they get really, really hot. From time to time, they might just explode or pop or fail. So this gave off an enormous amount of heat. Now, this one is actually a rebuild. I'll come on to that in a moment. So there's a mechanism here that some people refer to as the Heath Robinson, and you'll see pairs of reels with long streams of paper. I can just about zoom in, that run over those reels. And those streams of paper are perforated and they've got lots of holes that have been punched into them. And these holes represent a code. It could be a code that was not used necessarily on German U-boats or aircraft or something like that, but more top secret than that again. So there was a device, an encryption device called the Lorenz machine. And this would have been used by the German high command. We're talking about Hitler and his generals at the very, very top of the command. And all over occupied Europe in the Second World War, they had to be able to have secure radio communications, which a lot of the time was Morse code. So if you or I were listening in, we'd have heard beep, 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 beep. And even if we knew Morse code, we wouldn't have been able to understand it because these were so heavily encrypted Now, people talk about the Enigma code and how amazingly detailed and complicated that was, but Lorenz was even more complicated again. So an engineer by the name of Tommy Flowers, he actually built the very first working prototype of Colossus, and it was inspired or helped by the work of Alan Turing, who people recognize as the father of computer science. So this machine, there would be a single pair of paper tape, and it would spin through this machine over these reels super fast, probably here about 30 miles an hour or so, but it could go up to much faster, to the point that at one point it could scan close to 10,000 characters a second. That is enormous, like, speeds. The only problem was, with it being paper traveling at nearly 70 miles an hour, it starts to disintegrate. It could even catch fire. What were those temperatures? And you'd have to start all over again. So running at half the speed was seen as a much better option. So what would happen is, operators, the people who would operate this machine, this computer called Colossus, they would feed in these Lorenz cipher codes, and Colossus was used to try to decipher and make sense. So when it was being used in 1944, on the 5th of February, that was for the first time the Allied forces were able to understand what were these top secret communications. So when they were planning things like the D-Day landings in Normandy, it meant that the Allied forces already knew what the German generals were talking to amongst themselves secretly. Now, a couple of amazing things about this Colossus computer. So, as I said, it's the first computer in the world, but to program it, you wouldn't program it in the way that we do nowadays. At the back of this machine, where I showed you all these plugs and switches, well, that's how you programmed it. It was by rewiring it. So if you just wanted to run another program, well, you couldn't just do that. You would have to manually disconnect and reconnect lots of these plugs to put them in the right settings. Now, because this was based at Bletchley Park, so this is where we are now. We're in Bletchley at the National Museum of Computing, and it was all top secret. So you'll have heard of GCHQ. Well, back then in the Second World War, it had a different name. It was called the Government Code and Cipher School. And everything that went on there was top secret. People who worked there weren't allowed to talk about it for many years afterwards. And in fact, the Colossus machines, what I told you was 10 were completed and built, they were all destroyed and dismantled afterwards. And all of the engineering diagrams that people could follow to understand, they were all destroyed as well. So there was a gentleman by the name of Tony Sale, and he's dedicated a lot of the later part of his life to the rebuild or the reconstruction of this Colossus Mark II. Now, when you visit the gallery, you can read all about the story on these panels over here. I've just given you a tiny, like, skimming on the surface. But you can read all about the different breakthroughs and what happened. And there's photographs of Tony Sale and Margaret Sale, his wife, on the wall, and diagrams. And you'll see little things like Morse code, details in the design there to give you a little bit of a clue. Now, I asked 5 questions. If you think back to what those questions were, I perhaps need to expand on what the 5th question was. So we know now where it was, what it was called. As I mentioned, the first one was built in 1943, and then they were used from 1944 to 1945. It was built to decipher or decrypt German high command secret messages, used the Lorenz cipher. And we didn't know, as ordinary members of the public, we didn't hear about this for about 30 years after the war had ended. So today, it's now used as a working exhibit for demonstration purposes at the National Museum of Computing. And when the museum is open, streams of visitors come every day to visit Colossus and learn about this amazing piece of history that happened in England during the Second World War. Now, we're going to go on another adventure, and I have some more questions. So our second adventure today, it's not to do with the first computer, or is it, of sorts? So we're going to travel to another location, this time in England, and it's at the south of Yorkshire. It's just over the border from Derbyshire. If you were traveling from Derbyshire, it's just over the border. And it, like, just for some context, so computers, we use them heavily nowadays for lots of working things, but we like to relax and use them for our leisure and for entertainment purposes. And there is a rapidly growing industry in the UK that some people call interactive entertainment, some people call it the video games industry. And if you are interested in playing video games, creating video games, maybe you love to study or create the artwork, the characters, or the scripts for games, there's a truly amazing attraction that you can visit, as I mentioned, in the south of Yorkshire, close to Derbyshire. And this one, it's unique. It's the only one of its kind in the country. There are other attractions like it, but none exactly. So some of the questions I'm going to ask you, number 6, which city is it that we're heading to? South of Yorkshire, just over the border from Derbyshire. What's the name of the attraction? You might already know what it is I'm talking about. So I've given you some clues: playing video games, creating video games. What might you see inside this attraction if you were there today? And although today, at the moment I'm recording this, it's closed, but they do have lots of activities and content on their website that you could make use of. And then it costs many hundreds of £1,000s a year, hundreds of thousands of pounds to run this attraction. Why does it exist? What purpose does it serve? So they're my questions. So again, you might want to pause for a moment to write down your answers to those questions, to think about the answers to those. And in a moment, we're going to go and visit the attraction on our second adventure. So here we are. So I'm using some Google photos to help me recreate the inside. So we see some characters there from a game you might recognize. Let me zoom out a little bit more. So there's a wall over there with lots of other examples of games. There's a family and some young children. There's lots of tables with things like consoles and PCs. What have we got here? Some old TVs, computer monitors. Games you can sit on. Let's see, what else have we got? Games you can stand up on and be jigged about or jump about. What else have we got? Space Invaders. And you'll notice lots of these games have got these coin slots. So these are often referred to, these cabinets, as coin-op machines, coin-operated, because you used to have to put coins in. Like in the American films, you hear them say to put a quarter in, 25 cents. Over here in the UK, probably like 10 pence, 20 pence. And then with inflation, we went up to £1 or more. It's Donkey Kong. And you'll recognize some characters from some of these games and some of the props, like that one over there. Okay, so we're in the National Video Game Museum, which is in the city of Sheffield. And I can't do a lot of exploring, but what I do have is I have a photo album that somebody has shared with me. So I can tell you that there's walls just full of vintage retro 8-bit video games, and you can pick up controllers and you can decide which games that you want to play. And in all sorts of different manners. You might be there on your own. You might see props and objects. There's a banner for the museum. What else have we got? Sadly, there's some things that it's just not possible to touch physically because they are so rare, but you'll see things like different Atari video games controllers. So they're from like the 70s and 80s. What else have we got? We'll see some very rare examples of games. And there's one that I want to find. It's called a Magnavox Odyssey. And it was the very first that I'm aware of video games console for use at home that you could buy that was marketed. And I think that was released in something like 1977. And when you were playing this game, the way it worked is it in, oh, it's in the next photograph. The way you changed the game was you just popped in different cards with different patterns on, and there's one there you can see with all these metal strips, like an early form of game cartridge. Of course, nowadays everything's all online, like our trip to the museum. And you'll see early examples of PlayStation consoles and Xbox consoles and lots of artifacts and memorabilia from the 1980s, where people used to make their own covers for cassettes, and Game Boy systems as well. Now, we're going to go and visit the website for the National Video Game Museum, because I asked you earlier, if the museum is closed, what might you find there? Why does the museum exist? So they believe, just like films and TV and drama and art, video games are for everybody, and it's a huge, big cultural element of our lives. And as well as that, it's a rapidly growing industry. So at the time I'm recording this, it's believed that the UK video games industry contributes something like £6 billion to the UK economy and employs about 30,000 people in full-time roles. So while the museum is closed, there are things you can go and visit. You can visit aspects of the museum. They have a blog. You can subscribe to their mailing list so you can find out about things that are happening in the future. You can visit their exhibitions. So these are all links that are available from the bottom of the page. So they have different exhibitions. So there's one all about the arcade, and you can read about the arcade and the history behind that. If you visit the learning link on their page, they do host school trips, just not today at the moment that we're recording this. There's a learning at home program, and I'll mention Pixel Heads in a moment. So the Learn at Home, they have a Twitch channel, and you can find out about their learning resources. They run activities, so things like getting started with pixel art, building your own video games, text-based adventures. So you'll find lots and lots of links and resources and videos that you can download. And I mentioned Pixel Heads before. Pixel Heads are their online community that they run, but you can join, you can find out about it, and they have their own YouTube channel for there. So that's the National Video Game Museum in Sheffield. I asked you some questions. The questions I asked were, what is it? What might you see? What's on the website? And why does it exist? So perhaps you, as you're watching this, are thinking, oh, I have wondered sometimes about a career in video games, whether that's as a digital artist, as somebody who's going to be writing code, business management. There's lots and lots of opportunities within that sector. So we might pause before going on our final adventure. So we're about to start our final adventure today, adventure number 3. And I have some questions about that. So adventure number 3, let me get some notes here to help you. So we're going to head to another city. Now, this one is in the north of England. It's an industrial city, so it's been associated with manufacture for a very, very long time. In fact, during the Second World War, this city was where a lot of aircraft and ammunition, radio and radar equipment for the war effort was manufactured. And part of the reason why this particular city was chosen, well, one is it was well known as a city of manufacture from the cotton industry. But in the Second World War, it just so happens that this city was located so far in the north of England that it wasn't seen as a viable target of attack from German bombing aircraft, because for the aircraft to fly over the channel, yes, London was targeted a lot by aerial bombing, but in order to get up to the north of England, an aircraft carrying bombs, it was just too far for the early aircraft. Things have changed now. So a famous computer scientist, I did mention the name of this computer scientist earlier, spent the last 6 years of his life in this city. Now, if I say famous computer scientist, I'm not really doing full justice. I should have said the very first computer scientist, because that's what he is often referred to as. So here's some questions. What's the name of this northern city? Anybody with an interest in football could tell you that they've got 2 sort of world famous football teams. The name of the computer scientist I'm referring to, now by a matter of coincidence, he and I share our first names. Some people say he invented the computer. Well, I don't know if anybody single-handedly invented the computer, but certainly a lot of his work that he published in the 1930s and the 1940s did lead to the development of computers. Others say through his efforts, the Second World War was ended a few years earlier. Other people say, well, nobody did that on their own. And while his achievements were fantastic, it was the work that he did that led to other people doing those things. Now, we've had, in the last few years, we've had a few new banknotes introduced into circulation. Well, there's going to be another new banknote, and this computer scientist that I've mentioned will appear on this new banknote. Now, at the time I'm recording this, they're not quite available yet. I managed to find an image of what it might look like, and I've printed it out. So, you know, if you like your computing teacher quite a lot, you might want to get hold of one of these banknotes and give it to them as a present. But how much would it cost you if you were going to do that? So what's the new banknote? And then my final question. Now, you probably don't know the answer to this, but you might be able to work it out. So this computer scientist that we're talking about, there was one particular subject at school that this computer scientist did better at than all the others and really, really enjoyed this subject. And if you were to write out the name of this computer scientist's full name, like middle name as well, you'll find the name of this subject embedded in their middle name. Now, what do I mean? Well, if geography was their favorite subject, this person's middle name might have the word geography in it, but it's not geography because I wouldn't have told you the answer yet. So at this point, you might want to pause while you consider and write down your answers, because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us to that very city to find out. So I'm looking at a map here of a city in the north of England, and I'm just outside one of the train stations. Well, it's got a few train stations. It's got one that's called Manchester Victoria. It's got another one that's called Manchester Oxford Road. So all of the train stations tend to have Manchester in the title. So I've kind of given the game away as to which city it is. And we're going to touch on the ground just outside Manchester Piccadilly, which is perhaps, or maybe not, where this computer scientist first arrived in the city. So I'm landing on the A6, which is known as London Road. So if you were in Manchester and you were going to drive to London, you might head down the A6. So there's tram tracks here, there's people waiting to cross. I don't know if you've been to Manchester and seen the trams, but they make this loud hooting noise that I've not heard trams or other vehicles ever make. So it's kind of fairly special. Now we're going to head down this street here. It's still the A6. And we're going to follow this bus. There's always building work going on in Manchester. And there's the bus, and we're on Whitworth Street. And it's the point where we're going to leave this bus. And as I look around, we're just at a park here. And this park is called Sackville Gardens. Now, these photographs, I'm guessing, looking at the foliage on the trees and the daffodils, I think this is probably going to be something like April or May when these photographs were taken. And here we are at Sackville Gardens. Well, I've got some photographs that I took back in, let me see, I might have to just... Okay, so these photographs that I'm going to share with you, these were taken back in February when the leaves hadn't yet come out. It was a lot colder. And on that day that I was there, it was very, very rainy and wet and muddy in the park. Now, often in this park, you'll see huge crowds congregated around a particular memorial or statue. No, it's not the statue of Colossus. That was earlier in part one. So we're going to go over and visit this memorial. And my photographs will help me to do that. So there's actually a few memorials in this park, but one of them, as you just see there, features the image of Alan Turing, the father of computer science. So let's get a bit closer. So, we've actually got two Alans in the photo here. So you can see me standing on the left. There I am with a scarf, trying to keep warm in February. I haven't got my hat on, but I'm holding my umbrella and my packed lunch as well. And I'm standing next to Alan Turing, and he's made out of bronze, and he's sat on a bench. And if you look at the spaces either side of the bench, so you could, if you chose to, you could sit down on the bench next to him. You could put your arm around him. You could pose for a photograph, as lots of people do. Lots of people who visit the city, they realize that this is just 2 or 3 minutes walk from Piccadilly Station. They head over there. Sometimes they bring bunches of flowers. So Alan Turing, I don't know that he particularly collected flowers, but he studied patterns of repetition. There was a paper he published called morphogenesis. It's a hard word to pronounce, but it was studying patterns of repetition in nature and whether, you know, algorithms aligns with this or something. So people will often bring him flowers, particularly on the 21st of June when it's his, 23rd of June when it is his birthday. Now, I asked you some questions before about his name and his favorite subject at school. Well, behind his figure on the bench, there is some letters set into the parallel section. So it says Alan Turing, 1912 to 1954. So he died 9 years after the Second World War had ended, but it's his middle name. Now, you can't see it so clearly here, so I'll have to read it out. It says Mathison, M-A-T-H-I-S-O-N. So the subject maths or math appears in his middle name. And there is another inscription below that some people say, oh, that must be Enigma code. I'm not convinced it's an Enigma code for another reason that we might go into at another time. And sometimes people say, what might be buried underneath this statue? So there, apparently, I'm told, there are things buried underneath the memorial. No, not Alan Turing's body. That would be a little bit too grim. So underneath the statue, there's some like stone flags, and buried just below are two objects, I'm told. One is like a PDA or personal organizer. So these are like the predecessor to smartphones. So something like this. And a 1980s computer, a home computer called an Amstrad, one like we might have seen at the National Museum of Computing, or that we might have seen at the National Video Game Museum in Sheffield. So back to our questions. Are there any that we didn't answer? So what was the name of the northern city? Who is the computer scientist? The new banknote. So I think from memory, it's in sometime in 2021, the new £50 note will be printed and it will have the image of Alan Turing and some other designs. So I'm sure lots of you will have pockets full of these at some point when you're rich and successful, and you may have a spare one that you can give to your teacher that they can keep as some kind of thank you gift from you. So that's the £50 banknote, and we did cover that one. So thank you very much. I can stop sharing my screen now. It would be really helpful if you get time today or in the next few minutes. I'm doing more and more of these tours, and I'd like to think of other ways, other places we can visit, other themes, topics. There's loads of places around the world. We could go to Silicon Valley, where there's the Compute and History Museum. We could go to London, up into Scotland, Wales. There's places all over we can travel. And I wonder, are there particular themes? But go back to my questions. So one of the ones I want to know is WWW. What worked well? What do you think today that you enjoyed or you felt particularly was successful? But also there's a way you can help me in the future. So I'll probably be doing more of these this week and the week after. So if you can think of an EBI, something that would be even better, like, and so you could suggest to your teacher, like, oh, maybe if he was to do this or less of that, or if he had more of the other, anything that you think would help improve this. So thank you very much. That's the end. And I'm going to wave goodbye now as I stop the end of the recording.